Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening at our webinar, Recruiting and Retaining Migrant Workers Post-Brexit and Beyond, held in association with Burkitt's Legal Advice. I'm Rhian Price, the Livestock Editor at Farmers Weekly, and I'll be chairing this evening's discussion. UK immigration policy has undergone the biggest change in decades. Free movement ended on the 31st of December 2020, which means that EU nationals are now subject to the same immigration system as non-EU nationals. This new system is complex and involves additional cost and compliance. Tonight, our panellists will attempt to explain the changes that have come into force. They will also guide you through what practical steps and paperwork employees must put in place for EU workers to minimise disruption ahead of the impending deadlines. We will then move on to discuss how the industry will be affected long term and what can be done to overcome the challenge of staff shortfalls in the future. We have 5 panellists. I'll introduce each one ahead of their presentations. They have been asked to speak for 5 to 6 minutes each. We will then move on to a Q&A session at the end of the discussions, where our panellists will answer any questions that you may have. To ask a question, you simply need to type it into the question box on your screen and submit it, and I will do the rest. Before I introduce you to our first speaker, could I please ask everybody to participate in the first poll of this evening? This should be displayed on your screen shortly. So the first question we have is, have your employees applied for settled status yet? And you simply have to answer yes, no, or don't know. Mike, I know that you've already had experience with this because you've been helping some of your employees to apply for settled status. What's been your experience so far?
The experience so far, Rhian, is they're fairly okay with it as long as their English is good. But we, on most cases, have overseen that application and helped them with any difficult questions and made sure that they've got it back correctly. So it has been fairly straightforward. Most of ours were done in the first couple of months of the year.
And did you download the app on your phone? Because that's something that we tried to do at home, and I didn't find the app was that great, to be honest.
No, definitely the app was not good. That was definitely not good. No, we did it using on the desktop, to be quite honest, and found that was the most straightforward way. Most applications were back within 14 days. The longest one was one employee who had inadvertently travelled here on his identity card rather than his passport. So that did take a little bit longer. But apart from that, it was very straightforward.
Good. Okay, so I can see the poll results are in. So 61% have said yes, their employees have already applied for settled status. 22% have said no, and 16.7% have said that they're not sure. So this brings me nicely on to tonight's first speaker, Sasha Woolridge, a senior solicitor at Burkitt's who specialises in UK immigration. Sasha is going to set the scene and explain the new requirements around settled status and also sponsorship. So over to you, Sasha.
Thanks very much, Rhian, and nice to meet everybody, and thanks all for joining. So my name's Sasha, and I'm an immigration solicitor by trade. So I spent the last decade really trying to help clients to navigate the UK immigration system, and as we've already kind of touched upon, there's been huge amounts of changes that came into effect from December that are going to impact everybody. And I've also got a fair bit of experience in terms of working with the government, developing their immigration policy and developing that with them, and sort of seeing how practically that works for people. So happy to kind of share my experiences with you today. And I think really, you know, in terms of the topic today, really essential for both recruiting and retaining your existing workers. And I think, you know, those poll results that we've just had in, you know, a little bit over 60% of those on the webcast today have seen that their registration, you know, their employees have already registered, which is great to hear. And I think that really reflects the numbers that the Home Office are reporting. So The Home Office estimated there were going to be 3.1 million Europeans looking to apply. They've received over 5 million applications, and I think they've issued status to around 4.9 million individuals. So quite a few more people using that system than perhaps were intended, but great to see that so many people have done that successfully already. The one thing that I did want everyone to take away from today is, for that 22% of those on the webcast today who haven't yet registered, one of the things that I really wanted to highlight to you is that there is a strict deadline of the 30th of June. So we've got almost exactly a month until that deadline for everyone to make their registration applications. And that really is essential. We are yet to see kind of detailed guidance from the Home Office about whether they'll accept late applications. But it's really timely to be speaking to your employees now, or making the registration yourself if it applies to you, and to go through that process. We've already touched upon there being an app to make the application, and hopefully people will find it fairly straightforward. I think from my experience as an immigration solicitor, it's probably the most kind of sophisticated and user-friendly service we've seen for quite a long time out of the Home Office. It's quite impressive, and most of my clients that I've worked with have been able to get the application at least submitted with about sort of 15-20 minutes of using the app, but the processing times can vary. So I think the key thing to take away is it's just important to file the application before that deadline in June. If you don't get a decision before that deadline, don't worry, that's not going to be a problem for you. But it's just essential that you've made your application in time. And in terms of your workers, to reassure them, it's completely free of charge. As I say, mostly the application will be done online. So there's, rarely a need for people to go to visa appointments or to do anything that's, too much of an inconvenience. And although, yes, English proficiency is important to be able to use the app, there's no kind of English testing involved in the application process. So, do encourage all your employees to meet that deadline. But one thing I did want to reassure you of, if you are an employer, is that in fact you're not required to check that your staff have made that registration in time. So there's no legal requirement. Obviously, you might be familiar with doing right to work checks when you recruit someone, but there's no requirement. The Home Office aren't asking you to check retrospectively that your employees have done that. Although having said that, if you've got any new workers that you're going to be recruiting and onboarding from the 1st of July, we are expecting that to change, and you may well need to check their status later on. So I've only got a couple of minutes, but I'm just going to just to summarise around the EU settlement scheme. What is it, and why are we doing it? And it's really just to get a recognition of their rights, that they were here before the end of the transition period, and it gives individuals the right to continue living and working here. They'll get issued with a status, and they'll get sort of an electronic document. So employers, if they're renting a property, the banks might check their status in future. They will need that reference number. But I say it just kind of protects the status that they've already got. And the good thing is that it's not linked to any specific employer. It's an individual right that they have. So key takeaway, 30th of June is your deadline. Please do encourage everyone to make sure they've registered on time. So then I'm going to move on just briefly to talk about how to approach, recruiting new workers. So obviously your existing employees are protected, which is great news, and it's not going to incur any additional costs for you as a business for them to make that registration. But new recruitment is certainly this is a new challenge for lots of organisations, not just within the sort of farming and agricultural sectors, but across the country, where many businesses and organisations have not previously had to engage with the immigration system and have relied heavily on European or British workers to fulfil their talent needs previously. Now, with COVID, there's obviously increased unemployment. So, this might potentially buy us a little bit of time, and there may be, local workforce that we can rely on. But we do know, and I'm sure we'll come onto this later, that there is obviously a challenge getting enough people with the right skills at the right time. So recruitment of workers going forward is really going to rely on the visa system. the visa system changed in December. So you might have heard about the points-based system that was a common talking point during the referendum. And the good news is we do have a points-based system now. So it's quite transparent about how to apply for a visa. But the first step is that you as an organisation and a business need to register yourself that you want to recruit overseas talent to come to the UK to fulfil a role. So that's really step one. And then step two is getting a visa for the individual. And the ability to apply for the visa depends on the role that they're doing. And there's also some other requirements in terms of minimum salary you have to pay. And they also have to satisfy an English language test requirement, which again, Europeans never had to do that before, but that's a new part of the visa process. So if we just go on to the next slide, I have put up a couple of examples of where it is possible to sponsor individuals across these sectors. Historically, there was very little capability within the system that would have supported sponsorship for roles across agriculture, farming and horticulture. There was a big review of those roles in December, and a lot of additional scope was included. So some of the roles that you can see on there, they are sort of medium and high skilled roles where we know there's not sufficient, there's not sufficient skill in the labour market to fill that with UK workers. So those are an example of some of the roles that you can sponsor. Not all roles are there, and certainly any of the lower skilled roles you will find it more difficult to fulfill with a visa candidate. So just going back now to the previous slide, then I did just want to very briefly touch upon the fact that there are minimum requirements, but I think probably critically for business organisations is what's the cost involved at the moment, obviously, or previously you were able to rely on EU talent, and that was free of charge. There was no immigration costs. And I think the key thing for everyone to be aware of is that visas are very expensive for the UK. So I've put a couple of examples on the slide there, but if you're going to get someone a 3-year visa, you're looking in excess of £5,500 to sponsor that individual to come and work in the UK. So that's obviously a big chunk of their, of their cost. You're already paying the salary, and you're going to have to pay this in addition to bring them in. And there are also minimum salary requirements. So you can see on the screen there, if they're under 26, it's a little bit of an easier threshold to meet. So about 20,480 is the minimum. If they're more experienced or older individuals, that salary threshold's higher. So there's quite a lot to navigate there. So I think certainly I'm seeing more and more organisations come to me for advice and across, different immigration advisors to try and navigate that. But I would say the government websites are quite good. So do go to those in the first instance, because they are trying to translate the legal requirements a little bit. And I think just a final point on that sponsor licensing is that previously you might have been aware there was a requirement to advertise roles to the local labour force first before you could bring someone in. And that's no longer mandatory. So it's making it much quicker to recruit and to bring in sponsored workers where that's necessary. So separately to that, so sponsor licensing is really for sort of longer term people that you're going to recruit and retain in your business. But you might already be familiar with, and I know that some of the other panelists are going to speak about this with some more experience, but the seasonal agricultural worker scheme is an alternative visa system that can be used to bring some workers in for up to 6 months of the year. And this has been specifically designed as a pilot scheme for those that are helping, really they're picking the fields for anything around the edible horticultural sector. And it is still a pilot scheme. So it's something that's been expanded upon since last year, which is great, which shows the Home Office are getting comfortable with that as a visa option. It's notably an awful lot cheaper than the sort of £5,500 that I talked about previously to use the seasonal agricultural worker scheme. But I'm very conscious that a lot of people on this webcast today, you're not in edible horticulture, or you've got a longer term need than just 6 months a year. So I think one of the key takeaways is, whilst that's a good option to have, it's not going to satisfy the needs of the entire sector. So there will be increased reliance on the sponsor licensing system. But of course, the government did dedicate that they were going to bring in a points-based system, and that's what we have there. So that's a little bit of an overview of the current regime, and I'm looking forward to taking some of your questions later on in the session.
Thank you, Sasha, for that very comprehensive run through in a short space of time. Next up, we have Mike King, RABDF council member and dairy farmer from South Gloucestershire, who milked 700 Holsteins alongside his brother. Mike's going to talk about the challenges that he's encountered when helping his foreign employees achieve settled status, and what RABDF are doing to help farmers recruit. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Yes, as Rhiannon said, my name is Mike King. Apart from being a dairy farmer, yes, I've been heading up some of the work that RABDF have been doing regarding overseas labour, and as we just touched on, I will be touching on that later on in the presentation. First of all, thank you very much all for joining us today, and I'll get started and see if we can get a bit of a discussion going later. We milk 700 cows on a high yielding 3 times a day system in South Gloucestershire, and have currently employ 5 overseas guys who work for us, and this is actually 2 less than it was a year ago, and those guys have been replaced by UK workers. We've been employing overseas labour now for just in excess of 20 years, and quite a lot has changed in that period of time. We've also got used to their different styles of working and their different customs. Initially, on the onset when we started with overseas guys years ago, we employed them mainly through an agency. And they lived in mobile homes. Today, that's very different. We employ the workers. They're employed on a full-time contract. They're not seasonal workers. They're mainly skilled. They're mostly university or college graduates back in their home countries. They are on salaries which are above the threshold that Sasha just touched on. And they are living in barn conversions of old agricultural buildings that have been converted into very quite plush accommodation. We have identified that within our own business that the UK staff in the past have always been perhaps less attracted to our industry, and we have, as a business, have identified that that's quite a bit of that is down to us. We haven't sold ourselves very well as an industry, particularly in dairying, and it's something that I think we all need to address, and something we've done. We've looked at our profile within the local community, websites, Facebook, YouTube, many of those mediums to get our name out there, so that actually when you do advertise, you do actually get quite a bit of sharing on social media platforms, which does help spread the word. As a result, we have had 2 of our guys who've already were with us last year, and we did leave to remain for them, apply for leave to remain, but they actually decided to go back home. So there has been no opportunity we see as a route at the moment to bring them back in. So it's very important that we actually look to go to using UK labour. If I can quickly move on to the work that RABDF have been doing on some presentations that were superb. So we've been extensively running surveys as an organisation. We're the only organisation in the UK that solely represents UK dairy farmers. And it's obviously been identified that recruitment of labour on dairy farms has become quite difficult. And obviously, as a result of Brexit, this has been reduced. And we wanted actually to find out in a later survey that we've done to say what impact Brexit has had on the labour situation and what can be done to help and solve this issue. So next slide, please. So of the farms surveyed, and it was quite a large sample, I haven't actually got the numbers with me here, but 63% of dairy farmers said they had difficulties in recruiting in the last 5 years. And this was up from 51% at our last survey in 2016. 80% of farm staff said that farm staff was something, recruiting them was something that worried them. And a third had said, worryingly, that they would consider quitting the industry due to lack of dairy labour. And the main reasons that they had found that people don't wish to work on a dairy farm, particularly, is the long unsociable hours, which we as an industry need to tackle. And next slide, please. just over 42% said that respondents said they had employed farm workers in the last 5 years. And from our research, we estimate currently that the industry needs to access about 650 overseas workers or workers at the moment in the country. And this is based on 11% of dairy farms employing foreign workers in the last survey we did. Next slide, please. So all of this gives us a little bit of an issue. I think we do need to identify that there is an issue in the short to medium term. And the short to medium term, we as an organisation, RBDF, have put some numerous submissions into MAC and did a white paper about 2 years ago, which was presented to the Home Office and MAC as well when they were taking evidence. But as I touched on earlier in my own business, the key to solving this problem is actually the long-term labour shortage problem is actually trying to get UK labour onto dairy farms. Obviously better promotion as dairy farming as a career choice, and addressing the unsociable and long working hours, and that's something we have done ourselves. We're not expecting people to work in excess of 40 hours on a dairy unit. So actually, whereas a job before would have required somebody to do 60 plus hours, maybe, we now look to put two people in that position to make sure those hours are sensible. And then we need to think about how the college courses can be promotion to the wider audience, and that on courses like RIBDF run, which is Entrepreneurs in Dairy Farming, which is giving the opportunity for people to access a career in dairy farming. I think the other thing we need to address that is also, particularly in dairy, that somebody who's working as a full-time employee on a farm cannot be expected to live in a substandard accommodation. We need now to identify that they need accommodation which is suitable for them and a family, especially as they're a very valuable member and full-time employee. So I hope that gives you a very brief introduction, and I'd like to hopefully take a few questions a bit later. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mike. Really interesting what you were saying about addressing long working hours. How have you managed to get your weekly hours down to 40 hours, and what kind of daily hours are people doing on your dairy unit?
Right, so one of my full-time employees is actually only doing just over 35 hours. We've looked to bring in part-time people to actually look to more of a shift system, which we would have traditionally has been done outside of the agricultural setting, maybe in industry, and tried to look at those. We also work very closely and have a retained guy who runs his own business, who actually does all our HR and recruitment for us. And I think that's something as dairy farmers we've always tried to do ourselves, and I think we all must admit we're not very good at it. I think it's really important to actually to get somebody within your business that's has got the ability to see the problems and help you recruit, even if it is a part-time person, and actually enable you to sell your business as well.
So what kind of hours would your shifts entail then?
As long as there's not too many people on holiday, which there is at the moment, because now we can travel. Most of them, a lot of them, decide to go home after a year. Normally, we're aiming to be between 40 and 50 hours on the dairy farm, and yes, they're antisocial hours, but no one's expected. Those hours are not going either end of the day. Those hours are very much either early AM shift or a PM shift. So we're not expecting anybody to work unsociable hours, and those hours being split with a large time off in the middle of the day. I think that's something we can't expect people to do. So yeah, I think that's the way that we've seen it. But I think that very much so is that focus on trying to, as a long-term goal, trying to replace some of the overseas labour with UK labour, and even for us, that started with schools, and we've done a little bit of work with schools, and we hope that will pay us some returns as time goes on.
Great, thanks, Mike. Our next speaker tonight is Nick Allen, Chief Executive of the British Meat Producers Association. Nick is going to explain how these changes will affect butchers and abattoirs and the knock-on effect a shortage of staff could have on livestock prices.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for asking me to join this this webinar. The British Meat Processors Association, we represent the larger meat processors in the country. We probably are responsible for processing something like 85% of the beef in the country, 90% of the pork, and about 65-70% of the lamb. We don't do poultry, so I'm only speaking about beef, lamb, and the pork sector. The meat sector on the whole probably employs about 97,000 people at the last count, and there's probably a further 250,000 people in associated or an associated workforce that goes with that. So actually, it's we've got quite a wide scope. In 2018, when we surveyed our members the first time round, we had something like 69% of that workforce was actually non-UK. We've obviously, with Brexit coming, the people have been, our members have been trying to recruit from home rather than abroad. And in 2020, when we surveyed them again, we were down to about 62%. So we have made some progress in terms of moving that, moving towards being less reliant on non-UK labour. The interesting thing, though, is at the moment, having said that, it's a 10% reduction when we're just serving our members at the moment, and the anecdotal feedback we're getting, we're about 10% short of labour. So I'm not sure, it's possible that survey is just reflecting the fact that we're getting by with fewer staff at the moment, and it's quite challenging. A lot of our plants are in rural areas because they're geared up to really make it easy for livestock to get to them rather than people to get to them, which is a challenge in itself. But we have been there's no doubt about it, we've been very dependent on non-UK labour, and the vast majority of that would have come from Europe. Contrary to popular belief, this isn't cheap labour. A bit like Mike was saying, we pay, and the non-UK labour is paid exactly the same as UK labour. Unlike some other countries, we don't use a lot of contract labour. They are employed properly, and when they come here, it takes a long time to train staff. It's probably 2 years before someone coming into a plant and actually being trained in all the different parts of the line before you can move them around and actually with confidence. So most of the staff we're taking on, this is not seasonal labour, it's not sporadic. Most of the people we're trying to bring into the plants, we're hoping are going to stay for 3 years plus, really, and many of them have done in the past, and as a consequence have gone on to actually stay here in this country. We've been making sure, my members have been making sure all their staff are signed up for the EU settlement scheme, but already some of them are reporting that even though they've got those people signed up for the EU settlement scheme, they've gone home. Yes, so I'm taking the opportunity to go home, and they're not quite sure whether they're coming back or not. COVID has been incredibly sort of challenging. These plants aren't designed for social distancing. We've had to implement social distancing, so that's been sort of quite challenging. And also, COVID's meant it's a lot harder to get out to schools, got a lot, to actually try and recruit some labour and do that sort of stuff. And also, it's quite difficult to train, because training is very difficult, especially as well butchers and things like that, and maintain social distancing in the plant. So we've hit a bit of a hiatus in this last year, sort of during sort of COVID. One of our sort of frustrations has been that, like sort of Mike has mentioned, the white paper that went to the Migratory Advisory Committee. We managed to persuade the Migratory Advisory Committee looked at it, and they recognised that butchers should go on the shortage occupation list, and this would have obviously helped us and increased our chances of getting sort of people into the country. Unfortunately, despite the Migratory Advisory Committee accepting that recommendation and putting that forward, the Home Office have actually put that whole recommendation on hold. So this is actually sort of quite a sort of barrier for us at the moment, and we're just having yet another go at sort of lobbying government to try and get butchers on the shortage occupation list, because we can't actually see in the short term that we're going to fulfil our needs from at home. So recruitment at home has been sort of quite challenging. A lot of our members were starting to question whether the furlough scheme has actually got in the way of them employing sort of people, because there's probably a feeling that there's quite a few people that would come forward for jobs, but actually they're sitting, sort of having been sort of furloughed, and we're now actually regarding sort of furlough as possibly a sort of a barrier to actually finding people to work for, which is an interesting sort of challenge. Going forward, I mean, one should mention that actually automation is quite difficult in plants. Animals come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and whilst there are some, and I have had the privilege to sort of travel the world and see automated boning machines in other parts of the world, they're incredibly expensive and they're not very efficient. They leave a lot of meat on the carcass, and it's very, very difficult to design a machine that deals with all sorts of different shapes and sizes of animals coming through. So that's, it's not an easy thing to automate. And just to clarify that, when I'm talking about butchers on the shortage occupation list, the butcher's scope doesn't just talk about what we all think is butchers. That covers a whole range of staff throughout the abattoir, and the processing sector fall into that category, which is why we're actually determinedly going back to government and saying, look, we really think in the short term we need to have butchers, that category of butchers on the shortage occupation list. Otherwise we are starting to run into some serious difficulties. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, our plants are in rural areas, so they're not on transport networks, so transport is often a challenge. So language, I just briefly mentioned sort of language. The test, the English test for coming into this country is quite challenging. Some of our members have sent people that have been in the country for 2 or 3 years, and they considered quite eloquent and quite good at speaking English on that test, and they failed. And in fact, as a last resort, one of our members the other day, the head of HR, actually went and did the test, and even she found it quite difficult. So I think that language test coming in that enables people to come into countries, the barrier sets are quite high. So I hope that's given a bit of a feel for where we are at the moment. Our members are sort of trying very hard and looking at all sorts of, sort of different routes, apprenticeship schemes, training schemes. But as I mentioned earlier, this has been put on hold a bit during COVID in this last year. And we've lost a bit of ground. And like Mike, one has to hold your hand up and say, probably as an industry, we haven't been too good about, selling the image of the industry. Meat plants are quite sort of tough places, haven't got the long hours, but they are very driven places, and they're cold as well, and they're not most comfortable places to work in, but the pay is good, and actually if you're sort of minded, there's a good career opportunity there. And we've probably got to hold our hands up and say we failed about selling our industry as a good industry to come into, and we've got to work hard at that in the future. Okay, I'll stop there. I hope that's about the right timing. Okay.
Thank you, Nick. That was a really interesting insight into the issues affecting the meat industry. Are you doing any recruitment drives at the moment to encourage more UK workers to get a job in abattoirs and butchers?
Yeah, so all our plants, I mean, these are big, most of our members are big companies and have got their own sort of ways of sort of doing this and run their own recruitment drives. So yes, they're starting to sort of, you know, trying to run recruitment drives. It's been, as I mentioned earlier, it's difficult because you can't get out to the college, you know, being COVID, you haven't been able to get out to the colleges and the schools and actually sort of talk about it as an opportunity. But yeah, they obviously advertise locally, and you know, I think the figures are showing that they are sort of trying, you know, hard to recruit locally. But I have to say the retention of British sort of staff when they come into the plants isn't great. You know, you're lucky if you hold on to 60% of what sort of starts with you. So, because unfortunately there are other jobs down the road that are a bit more appealing, and even though the pay has moved up dramatically and it's quite good, you know, it's the tough conditions and, you know, competition down the road, and it's sort of Amazon distribution plant appears or something like that, then it's slightly easier work and it's more attractive. And we're concerned actually with the food service sector opened up, that's going to attract people away as well, actually. So there's going to be some stiff competition out there over the next year for staff.
And you know, you already talked about there's a 10% shortage of labour. If that gets any worse, do you think that we could see a knock-on impact on meat prices going forward, because abattoirs are going to have to work at like reduced number of days, etc.?
Yeah, I think you're already seeing it. I think they're already talking to retailers about rationalising some of their lines, because obviously, you know, the fewer types of, sort of products are going forward onto supermarket shelves makes it a bit easier and cuts down the sort of labour requirement. That's not great news for the industry, actually. So different product innovation is quite important for us going forward. So it's not a great place to be that we're cutting down the number of lines we're doing. And also, one might see that actually they're start to say to farmers there has to be a much more sort of, you have to book the animals further in advance and sort of tee things up so that it helps with the smooth running of the plant. And some of them have been opening on sort of Saturdays as well, actually, to sort of get everything sort of through. So it will, you know, we're getting to the point now, and we're getting pretty concerned about it, that actually there's going to be some impacts up and down the supply chain.
Thanks, Nick. So we're going to move on to our penultimate speaker tonight, who's David Camp, Chief Executive of the Association of Labour Providers. David is going to give us an insight into other avenues that the industry could explore when it comes to recruitment.
Thanks, Rianne. And I'm just going to get my slides set up. So I just want to paint a picture of labour supply and labour availability that we're seeing at the moment. This was our survey back in November, and it painted a bleak picture of the industry's expectations for 2021, with only 8% of growers and food manufacturers believing that there would be sufficient workers from the UK and the EU settlement scheme to meet the food supply chain's needs. Around 70% of businesses expected to struggle and be in crisis themselves with regard to the lower skilled workers they needed for their own business. And this is playing out. Every day I am receiving calls from our members asking me, where can I find workers? Where can I get workers from? This bullet point was a call I had yesterday, and the lady was saying it's just getting really tough out there. She's saying lots of Romanian nationals are returning to their home country. It's only going to get more difficult going forward, and as is often asked of us. It's saying it needs an immediate reaction from the government in the form of a temporary unskilled route. Call today from another member saying, a medium-sized labour provider saying, if I had an extra 3,000 workers, I could find work for them all. So the situation in the food industry, in manufacturing, agriculture, but also in hospitality, in construction, in all sectors that have a need for a range of skills. And I'm focusing on this presentation on the lower skilled workers, those who don't meet the criteria for the points-based system. It's going to be a very tough year. We have given many webinars, much training, much guidance on the labour pool, the labour availability pool that there is in 2021 under the new immigration system. I'm just going to focus on the three most common ones, the three most prevalent ones for our sector for this year, and starting with the EU settlement scheme. And as Sasha said, this is a scheme which has been open for some while now, and by all accounts, very successful. Of course, some challenges, but over and I think now we've gone just above the 5 million level that have been given pre or settled status to continue to work in the UK and to make their homes in the UK. The deadline is the 30th of June. The Home Office recently, in a call, indicated that there may be some cases where they will allow extensions, but the general deadline is the 30th of June. Our last survey identified that over 70% of food growers and manufacturers had said that more than 20% of their EU workers have yet to apply. And we've been encouraging and supporting all our members, all the growers, all the manufacturers that we've been engaging with over the last few months to do everything they can to encourage their workforce to apply to the EU settlement scheme, to work with them, as Mike said, to sit down with them, to help them to go through the process. Some people may have some reluctance. They may not be so good at literacy, and they may have some sort of fear of technology. So it's really important to be supportive of them, because you get to the end of June, you get into July, and we're going to see this coming along much more often. It's not really being spoken about in any of the publications by the Home Office, but the Immigration Act 2016 extended the legislation such that where a company has reasonable cause to believe that an individual does not have a legal right to work, then they're committing a criminal offence. It has the effect of rendering any right to work checks that they've done as invalid. And it means that they are committing a Section 21 employer criminal offence. And that has the potential of an unlimited fine and in a prison sentence. Now, I don't want to use scare tactics. Those types of punishments are for the most serious abuses of the scheme, not for honest mistakes. But the situation remains that this is the position. So if we get to, if businesses get to a position after the 30th of June, where they have a reasonable cause to believe that that EU nationals have not established that legal right to work, then they're committing the employer criminal offence. And the EU nationals themselves who haven't established that that immigration status that gives them a right to work are also committing a criminal offence. And the situation gets quite tough for these people at the end of June, because they and their families lose the right to use the National Health Service and other services. They lose the right to enrol in education or training or claim benefits. And if they travel home, re-entry may be refused if border control think they're coming back to work without the legal right to do so. We are getting many calls from our members of EU nationals coming over to work in the UK at the moment, being stopped at the border because they have not established the EU pre or settled status, and that they're not able to demonstrate to the border officials that they have the legal right to do so, and they're being turned away. So we are getting cases reported to us every week of that. So that's the first route, the EU settlement scheme. If you have EU workers, get them registered. We've spoken a bit about the seasonal workers pilot scheme. You probably know it's been extended for 30,000 places, edible horticulture only. 4 GLA licensed ALP members, AG Recruitment, Concordia, Fruitful and Proforce are the scheme operators, and the 30,000 licenses are shared between them. AG Recruitment and Fruitful were only appointed in May, and that delay in appointing them has really caused some challenges for those two businesses in how quickly they can ramp up and recruit the thousands of workers that they are tasked with recruiting through the scheme. There are other challenges in the scheme in terms of, for instance, when Nepal was put on the red list, the challenges this weekend with Belarus, the difficulty there is in many countries to get the number of workers through the visa processing centres, and the somewhat arbitrary costs that are applied if you want to get that done in a reasonable timescale. Placements are limited to 6 months. Licensed scheme operators may recruit workers from anywhere in the world. It is different to the old seasonal agricultural workers scheme. There are many different rules and operating conditions. There's a lot of focus from the media, from NGOs on the experience that workers are having. We're working with lots of representatives from the industry, NFU, DEFRA, Scottish Government, and so on ensuring that there is good practice applied within the scheme. We released a report last year. We're continuing that work that year. So seasonal workers, that's the second route. The third route is recruiting from the UK resident labour market. ALP has produced lots of toolkits and guidance on a good practice for sourcing workers, good practice for retaining workers, line managers' guide to improving retention of agency workers, and much more beside. Video which really promotes the food and agricultural industry that anyone can use in recruitment. But Mike made this point, if you are going to recruit from your local resident market, then it takes someone who knows that, who knows the populations, who knows how to recruit locally, knows how to advertise, can ensure that they've implemented an effective, professional, legally compliant process. One thing we've been working on is kind of a new generation of transport solutions and transport providers, which opens up the territory that you can recruit from without you as an individual business having to put on the transport yourself. So that has been an effective solution for a number of our members. There's no Pick for Britain scheme this year. If you want to work with the approved channels, the appropriate channels, then you advertise your jobs on the Find a Job website. I would encourage you to establish your a relationship with your local job centre and really get to them, really see how they can support you to recruit. But both Mike and Nick have made this point. Every business now is in a competition. Every single business is in a competition to attract and retain workers. So you have to look at your own business. Why would someone want to come and work for you? What's so good about you? What do you offer? Why is your business a good place to work? Of course, the work is going to be hard, but is it enjoyable? Are the wages reasonable? Are there decent hours? If you're providing accommodation, is it pleasant and reasonable? Are you a nice place to work? Are the people nice? Because that is so important, that people find it a community that they work in, where the supervision is supportive and friendly. Really, this is probably the most important slide about what your business is really like. So getting towards the end, what you need to do, understand the new right to work checking rules under the new system and make sure that your business is compliant. Work with all your EU workers to ensure they have settled status. Implement proper labour planning, recruitment and retention strategies, and make your business as attractive as possible for potential candidates. If you need workers, on the ALP website, we have a button which says need workers. You're able to enter your details and how many workers you need and be contacted by GLAA licensed ALP members who may have workers available. It's free of charge to do that, of course. Of course, if you're going to engage workers through a labour provider, then of course commercial terms apply. If you want more information, our webinars are free and open. We have one with the Department of Work and Pensions on the 11th of June, maximise applications from the UK resident workforce with DWP in your local job centre. Catchy title, does what it says on the tin. One on the 25th of June goes into a bit more detail about effectively sourcing and retaining workers in 2021. And one on the 2nd of July, we produced a toolkit, workforce recruitment and labour supply from 2021 with the Home Office. We're revisiting that, we're updating that and presenting on the immigration system and right to work after the grace period. If you have questions, we try and be helpful. Of course, we're a member-only service, but we're generally supportive. The details are there. Those last three slides are available as a download, and the team will tell you how you can access those. So, Rianne, that's my session done. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, David. We're going to take questions later. I'm going to move straight on to our last speaker, as I'm conscious of time and we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience as well. So next, I'd like to invite NFU Vice President Tom Bradshaw to speak. Tom is going to explain why farmers will have to build an evidence base to help address the challenge of recruitment in the future.
Thank you very much, Rian, and great to be part of tonight's webinar. Now, look, there's not a lot that hasn't really been said, so I'll try and keep this pretty brief so that we can get over to questions. I think we all have to be conscious that the new immigration policy is a result of the Brexit decision, and government feels that immigration was one of the key determinants in the vote for people deciding to vote to leave. So they've been really strong on wanting to build a new immigration policy. And I think we can't forget that when we're looking at how we need to access the workforce for the future, because it means we're pushing water uphill. It is very challenging to try and get the rules of engagement with government and a new immigration policy changed. At the EFRA committee last year, I was very clear that the current immigration policy is not fit for the future of farming or food production. I think we've always been very concerned about the knock-on effects for the processing industry, because clearly if we don't have the workers in the processing sector, then that has a direct impact on our members producing the food that needs processing by them. So this is very much an industry problem. It's not just about a primary production at a farm level. We've heard a bit about the shortage occupation list, and we know that due to the COVID crisis, there weren't any amendments made to the shortage occupation list last year. And we don't know when that list will be reviewed, whether there will be an opportunity to get any new jobs on there for 2022 or not. And a lot of that depends on COVID, and there's no promises that shortage occupation list will be changed for 2022. So it could well be 2023, which adds another complexity. We need to remember that seasonal workers are a feature of all developed economies around the world. The way that it's spoken about in the UK, it's as if we're unique in trying to recruit seasonal workers, but all developed economies are relying on the migrant workforce to come in and do these seasonal roles. And I think particularly on the seasonal roles, you have to question whether we want the UK workforce to be looking for roles that are only for 3 or 4 or 5 months, when hopefully there's longer term employment opportunities for they're able to fill all year round. So I think the seasonal roles are an area that are likely to be reliant on the migrant workforce as we move forwards. But you mentioned about evidence, and look, it's critical that as an industry we build the evidence base. This is one of the reasons the partnership with the Department for Work and Pensions and the Job Centre Plus officers is so important, because if we advertise the roles and there aren't the applicants coming forward for those roles, then it really does help build the evidence base, so that when we go to Home Office in the future to look for changes to the immigration policy, we've got some factual evidence from their own officers to base those asks upon. Even better is that we're actually able to recruit from those from working with the Department for Work and Pensions. But I do think that it's a challenge. I'm not convinced that they will provide the answer, but we must utilise their services to try and, as I say, build this evidence base. As we go through this year, we will try and build the seasonal workers pilot scheme. At the moment, there's no commitment for next year. We've seen the increase from 2,500 to 10,000 and then to 30,000 this year, which clearly we were delighted to see the size of that increase. Admittedly, it was very late in the day. I think it was the 23rd of December when we finally heard the announcement that we've been working on for so many months. That's meant there have been delays, as David said, in applying the new operators to the scheme. Hopefully we will be able to utilise all of those visas this year. Again, that could be used as evidence against us if we don't use all those visas, even though we all know the reasons that it's actually been because we've only had 2 operators until this point in time. There is a chance that not all of those visas, all the 30,000 visas, are used this year. We're trying to include ornamentals and poultry within the seasonal worker scheme as we move forwards. They are 2 sectors that are very reliant in different areas, but very reliant on seasonal labour. We've just done a survey for the daffodil sector, which the results will be out any day. This is the first sector that has had a season with the new immigration policy. Up until now, it's always been, if we don't have an immigration policy that does this, this, and this, these will be the repercussions. But this is now factual evidence of a season under the new immigration policy, and it's going to be very, very interesting to see the results that come out of that. I mean, the headline figure is those businesses are around 1/3 short of the labour that they require. Now, we know that this is at an absolutely critical point, not just for their businesses, but labour in general, and being able to get the recruits we need is business critical. And if those businesses can't get the labour they need, then ultimately they will not have a business moving forward. So it is absolutely business critical that we try and sort that out. One of the challenges that we're going to face moving forwards is that we've heard about the EU settled status scheme. Now, that pool of workers is no longer being replenished. And over the last decade, we'll have had workers coming over from different Eastern European countries, and the pool has always been topped up. But because of the new immigration policy now, that pool of workers is no longer being topped up. So you could say now we're at peak availability of the EU workforce, because after the end of June, there'll be no more that are able to register, and there are no more that are able to come in and join or move over here with the freedom of movement that they've had in the past. So as those workers decide to go into other industries or decide to return home over the coming years, then that's going to mean that that pool is diminishing rather than increasing or being replenished, which is going to add a challenge for the future. We heard a little bit about recruitment from the UK workforce. Look, we've got to develop apprenticeship schemes which really work for the apprentice and for the business. There is an opportunity as we move forwards that businesses will be more involved in apprenticeships. And I think that's something that really must be explored and must be made to work for the future. Furlough was also talked about, and it was on my list. I absolutely agree that at the moment, unemployment is still running at under 5%. There were predictions this time last year that we were going to end up with significant rises in unemployment, even to 8 or 9% unemployment. Because of furlough, that hasn't yet happened. And if you look to the hospitality industry, which is just beginning to reopen, they are finding it incredibly challenging to get the staff that they need. And I think the security of furlough means that some people may be not looking for opportunities or feeling the need to explore further opportunities because at the moment they're still receiving the furlough pay. So that is something that is a particular challenge. When we look at the points-based system, clearly the cost of visas is a real barrier there. It's expensive now to get the workers, even if they were on the shortage occupation list, and that's something that we're going to have to look at. But look, finally, I think every one of us on this call have got a job to do. We need to make our industry sexy. We need to make people want to come and join the agricultural industry. What can be better than working in an industry where you're responsible for feeding the nation while solving climate change at the same time? Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was excellent. Before we go on to our Q&A session this evening, we've got another quick poll to do. So we're going to put that up now. And while you're answering the poll, I just want to go back to you on one thing, Tom. You said that as an industry, it's really critical for farmers to build an evidence base and work together with the Department of Work and Pensions. So what kind of practical measures can they implement to ensure they are doing that?
So if you've got a vacancy, Rian, then you need to get in touch with your local Job Centre Plus and then make sure that the role that's available is advertised with the Job Centre Plus. Particularly in horticulture, the local job centres are being briefed by the Department for Work and Pensions, but jointly, the NFU have been putting a lot of resource into trying to help them understand the industry, because up until this point in time, they haven't understood agriculture. And so it hasn't, if there have been vacancies, they haven't known who to direct there. The beauty of the Job Centre Plus is that by the time somebody comes to you to apply for that role, they've already been filtered. So their suitability will have been looked at before it's suggested that they may be suitable for the role that you've got advertised. But if we use that, and if the potential recruits don't come forward, then that's what helps us build that evidence base that actually the UK labour isn't available and we need to look further afield.
Thank you. So we're still waiting on the poll results. While they're coming in, I'm going to move on to the questions because we have got quite a few that have come in tonight. So everybody feel free at this point to jump in because it might be that one person is better at answering these than someone else. So first question is the minimum salary requirements. Does this link to 39 hours?
I'll take that question if that's okay. So the 39 hours, so that's a really good point. So the government publish, or the sort of to sponsor a visa, there's two thresholds really that you need to look at just to add some complexity to it. So first of all, there's a minimum salary threshold for the visa category at all. So that was a 2 salary threshold that I had on my slide of 20,480 or 25,600. So regardless of the job that they're coming to do, that's the minimum salary you've got to meet, and that's irrespective of the hours worked. But then in addition to that, for each individual role, there are then salary thresholds that you have to look at, and there's a big government list of the applicable salary for that role. And those salary listings per role are based on 39 hours a week. So then you can pro-rata it depending on the contractual hours the individual's doing. So again, it can be a little bit tricky to navigate, but there's ultimately effectively 2 thresholds that you have to meet. And it's always the higher of the 2.
Thanks, Sasha. So we've had the poll results in, and 88% of tonight's attendees have said yes, it is harder to recruit. since the new rules have been brought in, and 11.8% have said there's no change. I mean, what's everyone's thoughts on that? Is that typical of what you would expect?
I think we have to remember that we've also got the COVID challenge, Rhiannon, and that has added complexity for everybody. So this is a new immigration policy that's having an impact, but couple that with the challenge of COVID, and it's made travel very challenging. We've touched on furlough, and that's meant that maybe we haven't got a workforce which is as fluid as maybe it normally would be, or are looking for other opportunities. And there's probably a nervousness out there in the workforce as well, and the job they have at the moment gives them security. But if we go into another lockdown, what would happen if I've just moved roles? And it's those sorts of challenges, I think, that we can't underestimate the impact that COVID is having at the moment as well.
Thank you. So I'll move on to some more of tonight's questions that we've had come in. We've had a question saying, we have had some staff go back to Europe due to COVID, so can they apply from Europe as they are planning to return?
I'll dive in again. I don't want to steal the limelight, but happy to answer that one. So the good news is, yes, you can apply from Europe. So the app that you need to download on your phone to do the ID verification, that works in Europe. Unfortunately, that government app doesn't work outside of Europe. So if you've got staff that are currently, in Asia, Central America, North America, it won't work there, unfortunately. But there are alternative means of applying. But certainly if they're in Europe, they'll have no problems applying. They will need to submit evidence that they were in the UK before the 31st of December. So if they've got prior utility bills or lease agreements, for example, in their name that they can submit, then they may need to upload that evidence to the website, but certainly nothing stopping them if they're not physically here at the moment.
Thanks, Sasha.
Sasha, can I just add to that? I think, and you can correct me if I'm not quite correct here, that they have had to be in the UK within the last 6 months. So they would have had to have been in the UK, I guess, in December. Is that correct?
Yeah, so to be eligible at all for the status, you've got to have been in before the 31st of December. And then if the individual hasn't previously been resident in the UK for 5 years or more, they'll be applying for what's called the pre-settled status. And to be able to get that, yes, you've got to have been in within the last 6 months. So obviously now we're in May, 5 months after the rules have changed, we're fast approaching that. So if they weren't in December, they may struggle a little bit.
Sasha, could I jump in and ask you a question, actually? Well, I've got a couple of questions from our members, actually, who knew we were going to be on this webcast tonight. One was one of our members had a member of staff who went back home on holiday, hadn't done his settled status, came to come back into the UK a couple of weeks ago, was turned around at the border and refused entry. Mm-hmm. Could you shed any light on why that could possibly be?
Yeah, sure. So there's certainly been a lot of widespread reports at the moment across the press of various European nationals that have been stopped and turned away at the border. And I know there was some new guidance issued by the Home Office to border officials earlier this week to encourage them to take maybe a more flexible approach to their entry. And that's really because the Border Force are having to navigate two different sets of rules applying to different individuals. So if you're a European coming to the UK for the first time after January this year, you're only allowed to enter the UK as a visitor, and therefore you're not allowed to work. But if you were in before December, you may well have rights under the EU settlement scheme, but haven't completed your registration yet. So there is a bit of a conflict there around how do you evidence what you're entitled for if you've not already applied. And even individuals that have already got their status. So there have been reports of people with a settled status document and reference number that have still had challenges at the port of entry. Ultimately, that is just an incorrect situation to have landed in, and is something that you could then seek assistance with to ensure your re-entry into the UK and to challenge that. So definitely there have been quite a lot of examples where people have just had an unpleasant experience at the border. but it doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, and people should certainly seek assistance and not give up. And I think the advice to Border Force has changed over the week due to the amount of reports of this happening.
All right, yeah, thank you, because that was one of my other questions. There's numerous members who have said that they've had members of staff who've come back from a holiday back in their native country who have settled status, who have been turned around at the border and sent back. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad that. So they should. So what you're saying is they should attempt to re-enter the country again.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, it depends on the specifics of what happened to them, their own circumstances. When you're detained at port, they give you a letter and a statement as to why you were detained, their findings. You will obviously be interviewed, etc. So, it's hard to give a kind of very specific answer to cases, but generally speaking, there shouldn't be anything stopping them coming back. If they are EU nationals and they're out in Europe and they haven't applied yet, to ease their entry, I would encourage making an application before, because you will at least get almost immediately a certificate of application emailed to you, which is an acknowledgement of the Home Office that you have an application pending where you're asserting your rights. So even though you've not got a decision, having that certificate pending is also useful. And making sure you can display that on your phone, having a printout of that PDF that you're carrying in with your hand luggage is also useful. So things like that is probably good to bear in mind to help them through that border process.
Thanks very much.
Sasha, if I can move on to another question.
Of course.
If an employee is an EU national and has already been granted settled or pre-settled status, does the employee still need to sponsor the employee? If not, does the employee require a visa?
So good news, any European nationals that have got either pre-settled or settled status are absolutely not going to need a visa. So you as employers can breathe a sigh of relief. There's no extra costs, so you don't need to apply for any kind of permit for them. That pre-settled or settled status is entirely sufficient for them to be able to work going forward. I say if they're existing employees, you're not even actually required at the moment in time to check that status. But I do kind of refer back to David's point, which was very good around, if you're put on notice, there is that risk of criminal offence if someone's not registered. But certainly if they have got it, you're all good to go.
Next question. Will the same pilot scheme be allowed to continue and ornamentals added to the list of crops allowed the workers to do?
Look, I guess we're all desperately hoping that the pilot scheme will turn into a permanent scheme, so that we don't have the annual debate as to whether it's going to be made permanent or not. I think the fact that we've got as far as we have, that more operators have been appointed, they're all positive signs. So we've got to believe that the scheme will be made permanent. And as I said earlier on, we're fighting to have ornamentals and poultry included for their seasonal work requirements. I know that doesn't change the situation for those that are short of permanent staff, but on the seasonal front, that is what we're looking to try and achieve.
Thanks, Tom. Another question. I understand there's a backlog of applications for EU settled status. What happens if a farm worker's application has been made, but they have not heard before the June deadline, if they have been successful?
I'll come in here. A conversation with the Home Office last week. They were very clear that they would take a supportive, flexible and pragmatic approach towards this, and their focus was in enabling those who are eligible to obtain EU settled status. So we are expecting guidance to come out on this very soon. We were shown a group of us were shown some initial guidance. There were quite a few questions on it, and we've not seen the next iteration of that. But there will be some guidance coming on and that in the next, hopefully in the next week or so. But certainly the Home Office's approach was to be supportive and positive about this.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that, and just to say that it's the critical thing is making the application. As long as you've made it, that's absolutely fine, and the Home Office will take time to go through the process. And I think in my experience with some clients at the moment, the processing time has gone up from, previously people were getting decisions in 1 or 2 weeks. Now it could be 8, 10, 12 weeks or more. But as long as your application's filed, that's absolutely fine, and there's no need to be concerned then.
And a very interesting question. Are there different rules for workers in the Republic of Ireland?
So great question. Unfortunately, the Republic of Ireland is obviously an entirely, we've got a very special relationship with Ireland, and the Good Friday Agreement protected rights for Irish nationals in Europe, inside the UK. Irish nationals coming to work in England can do so on the basis of their passport. There's no obligation for them to register under the EU settlement scheme if they don't want to, because they do automatically have a deemed right of permanent residence in the UK. Having said that, if those Irish nationals would like to register and would prefer to do so, then they are still able to use the scheme. So it's entirely voluntary for them. But no visas and no settlement scheme is mandatory for Irish nationals.
That is good news, isn't it?
Absolutely.
By not allowing the access of migrant workers to the UK, farmers will be forced to scale back. Some people have speculated this could lead to shortages and better prices, but surely if this happens, we will be forced to import more products which are not produced to UK standards. Do you think the government understands that by restricting migrant labour, it will be detrimental to the agricultural economy and we are going to sell our industry down the river? Tom, perhaps that's one you could answer.
Yeah, I think the thing that we struggle to get government to understand is that agriculture is the foundation of our rural communities. So it's not just the food production element that would diminish, it's actually our rural communities that would be much poorer as well. And I think that's a really important point that we continually make when we're having these discussions, is about the amount that we put back into society and back into those rural economies. I think the question is answered in themselves by, yes, unfortunately, we would end up becoming more reliant on imports. And that's something, when you look at the challenges around climate change, around biodiversity, even just the COVID crisis last year that highlighted that the just-in-time supply chain only just coped. And why would anyone want to put more risk into their food supply chain, which ultimately, if we don't produce it here, that's what the government would be, they would be taking that decision to increase the risk of a shortage. And I just think that that's, it's absolutely baffling that they would ever want to do that. The only reason we got the seasonal worker scheme to date is because of food production. And that is, it's something they're comfortable saying, that actually we don't want food shortages. That's why you've got a seasonal worker scheme. We are the only sector that has anything outside the wider immigration policy and as a seasonal workers pilot scheme, which is something that we are very proud of. But I think we have to look at the whole immigration system because it's critical that it's just not just seasonal workers that we can bring in, and we need to make sure that we can recruit for all of the different roles. But one of the things I am slightly concerned about, and Nick touched upon it, was about robotics. Is there seems to be a line that robotics is the solution, that you won't need the workforce if we get robotics working, when actually we're only about 60% self-sufficient in fruit and vegetables. So we've got huge opportunity to grow that sector. So we may well need the same number of people, but they may be used in different roles and used to produce more. But it's not about saying we need less people, even if robotics are part of the solution for the future. And they're still a long way from coming to fruition. So it's really exciting, the robotics sector, but it's not a solution that's going to be off the shelf next year or the year after. And realistically, it will be developing over the next decade rather than the solution of tomorrow.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question before we'll have to wrap things up. So the Home Secretary said exemptions can't be made for the agricultural sector, but why not? We have seen over the past 15 months that our industry has been key to feeding the nation. Anyone like to try and answer that?
I couldn't agree more. Actually, it's a frustration for all of us. The food industry's done an incredible job over this last 15 months in terms of keeping the nation sort of fed, and I've been, like a lot of people on this call, very close to watching the sheer effort that's gone into and the extraordinary lengths that have been gone into actually keep the nation fed. And I don't understand why it's not really appreciated by this government, and you don't feel it's appreciated. I think, in fairness to them, we're in a funny situation at the moment. We're coming out of COVID, as Tom mentioned earlier. But boy, have they got to do some hard thinking over the next 3 to 4 months about how they're what they want. And this doesn't just apply to the immigration policy, it applies to their trade policy as well, as to whether, because the decisions they make over the next 3 to 6 months are going to be really going to decide what the food production industry looks like in this country for the next 10 years.
Well, I think what I'd add to that, Nick, is that it feels like we've got a government which is being driven by ideology. They need to allow pragmatism. They need to allow reality and not be driven by the idyll of what it was going to look like outside the EU. Things have got to change, because if they don't, we've got an industry that's going to be on a knife edge. And we've got to start thinking sensibly. What is it that we want this country to deliver for the future?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I just add to that, and I know this has been said earlier on. It has to be based on evidence. We have to draw together the evidence by sector why we need a special immigration route. Now, if we can do that by roles such as in butchery, roles in poultry catching and poultry production, and other areas as well, then we can make special cases to extend a seasonal workers scheme. I think we need to ensure that we pull together to absolutely demonstrate that this industry can run a successful seasonal workers scheme that works for the growers, works for the scheme operators, works for the workers, and works for what government needs to achieve. If we do that, then we can build up from that on an evidence base into other sectors. And the fact that we are feeding the nation, the fact that we are and the workforce are fulfilling a critical role, I think stands in our favour. We need to work that. We need to make that case. We need to work together, and we need to extend these evidence-based sectoral schemes into other areas within our industry.
Thank you.
David,
I'm afraid I am going to have to stop everyone here. I think it's a really good point to end on, because we really need to drive home to farmers that they do need to evidence-based things. If we haven't answered your question, then we will answer them and we'll email the replies to you. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much tonight to all our excellent speakers. I think it's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you to our sponsor, Birkett, and thank you all for attending. A recording will be available tomorrow, and a link is going to be emailed to everybody who registered.
Thank you.
thank you.